Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Carbon Question Time session, which is being hosted by the Oxford Farming Conference. My name is Liz Bowles. I'm the Chief Exec of the Farm Carbon Toolkit and a Director of the Oxford Farming Conference. So just to let you know, the Farm Carbon Toolkit is a farmer-led enterprise. We're supporting farmers and growers to respond positively to the climate and nature crisis that we're in. And we provide really practical tools and resources by farmers, for farmers. And the organisation's now been going for 10 years. We're probably one of the oldest carbon calculators. For Oxford Farming Conference, those of you who attended the conference or indeed saw some of our reports, last year we commissioned a report into who owns the carbon anyway. And it was really that first step to understand, to help farmers to understand more about the carbon they're storing on farms, what their opportunities are, and really starting to think about how can they benefit from the carbon that they may be sequestering on farm. With this session today, what we wanted to do was to take that conversation forward to the next level, to give all of you the opportunity to ask those tricky questions. Also to focus on, actually, we hear so much about carbon sequestration, but we also know that in order to be able to respond positively to the crises that we're in, all of us, including farmers, need actually to reduce the level of emissions of our activities. That's us as human beings and us as farmers. So it's also an opportunity for all of us to explore how we can do that, as well as to start asking the questions about carbon offsetting, insetting, sequestration itself. How much carbon can soils really sequester? Do they ever reach a peak? So what this afternoon's session is all about giving you the opportunity to ask those questions. So if you want to start to think about the questions you'd like to ask my really brilliant panel whilst I introduce them, please think away. But this afternoon, we've really got a fantastic panel to help us to delve into all the questions that we need to be asking about carbon. So I'm going to start from this end to introduce the panel. So firstly, we've got Professor Jude Capper, and Jude's got two roles. She's the ABP Chair and Professor of Sustainable Beef and Sheep Production at Harper Adams University, and she's also an independent livestock sustainability consultant. She's also Treasurer of the National Beef Association, a liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Butchers, and is involved in apprentices and technical education. And I think I've known Jude for a long time, and I think her real understanding of the ruminant livestock sector is really pertinent to this afternoon's question time. And that's really why I wanted Jude to be on this panel, to address some of those tricky questions about ruminants. Our second panellist is John Gilliland from Ireland, and he's a former director of the Oxford Farming Conference, a farmer from Northern Ireland, Director of the Global Agriculture and Sustainability at Devonish, and Professor of Agriculture and Sustainability at Queen's in Belfast, and Chair of the innovative EIP Farmer-Led Carbon Farming Project. And I've known John for many years, really, through his association with Devonish, as well as through the Lighthouse Farms work that he's been doing in Ireland. Our third panellist is Janet Hughes. She probably needs little introduction. We're really delighted to have you this afternoon, Janet. She's a director of the Future Farming and Countryside Programme in DEFRA. And she's very, I think, modestly written the programme that's phasing out the CAP, phasing out those subsidies and introducing a whole new range of programmes and payments for farmers, whilst at the same time, and I heard you this morning, Janet, speaking about this, transforming the relationship between DEFRA and farmers. And I think I probably speak for all farmers when I say that it's really music to our ears to hear you say that that is the ambition for DEFRA going forward, because it's something that we all really welcome as farmers, to be able to have a positive relationship with DEFRA. Our fourth speaker, Alex Robinson. Alex is a founding director at Nature Capital, where he's responsible for advising landholders on how to establish their natural capital baseline. Again, very topical. I'm sure today, you will have walked down through the alleyways, and the number of businesses now offering these kind of services I'm finding it quite bewildering, and I work in this area. So I think, for farmers, this is something we're all trying to get to grips with. Who can we work with? Who's actually offering us what we need? So Alex is with Nature Capital, where he's identifying opportunities and unlocking values for farmers from their natural capital. Alex is a chartered surveyor, having worked for Savills, and prior to that, the British Army. So Alex, very much a farmer, so he understands all the sort of issues from a farmer point of view. And very much, not least, Johann, who many of you will know from Farmers Weekly, really been a stalwart journalist at Farmers Weekly for many years. I've certainly known Johann in that role for at least a decade. He's editor of the Farmers Weekly Transition Project, something which started last year, which is very much aiming to bring information to support farmers in their everyday activity, to look at how they can transition to more sustainable, more climate and nature-friendly farming. And I think I've made that bit up, but actually that's exactly what you said here, Johann. And it's also looking at it from both, and I think this is critical, and I think increasingly all farmers are asking these questions about how does this stack up financially as well as sustainably. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is your question time panel, and really we're welcome the first question, please.
Hi, everyone. I've got a question about permanence and soil carbon in farm systems. We understand in forestry systems, woodland carbon code, 100-year contracts, you're talking about permanence that go long periods of time. A few of the different carbon outfits here today are offering certificates of yearly sequestration rate, 5-year contracts, 1-year contracts, 10-year contracts. What happens at the end of those contracts? How do you ensure that carbon stays in the ground? And what happens in 20 years' time when the farm is sold, but those 5 years, 15 years ago were sequestered? It's a little bit more clear in woodlands and forestry, terribly unclear in habitats in between, and then on the farm level, everything's become quite short-term. I'm just interested to hear what everyone has to say.
Thank you very much for that question. So the question is very much about the permanence of carbon sequestration on farmland and what happens at the end of the term. And I think bear in mind that at the moment we're very much talking here about a voluntary carbon market where you're choosing to sell your carbon to a customer who will have requirements of you on that sale. So I don't know who, I would be tempted to turn first of all to you, Alex, in your experience. How do you answer that question?
Sure. So I think the biggest problem here at the moment is that we don't have the guidance, or at least some outline as to a farm soil carbon standard to start to work towards. So as a result, what you're all seeing is a sort of a rush from private businesses to develop a methodology which might be robust, might not be, but hopefully is starting to sort of push this forward. And I slightly, I'm afraid, push this back onto the public sector and probably DEFRA and go, come on, where's the standard? Where's the finance to come towards this? Where's even just a little bit of certainty for somebody to start to establish their baseline? I mean, Ivan, I think the key point is, I always bring this back to just because you can grow a crop of wheat on your ground doesn't mean you then sell everything forward. And the biggest pitfall is that people, I think, will sell forward the promise to deliver. And really that's what people are potentially doing if you want the money for it today and you haven't established a detailed baseline, let alone whether that's under a robust methodology or not. So there's a lot of pitfalls to get through. For me, I think soil carbon has got a huge potential to have a really supportive impact and benefit across the farming sector. But it really needs a degree of structure and at least guidance as a basic starting point so that everyone has a sort of minimum to work from.
Thank you very much, Alex. John, you wanted to mention something on this as well.
So my view about, first of all, if you're going to talk about permanence, you need to do your baseline. And my issue is that we're not doing our baselines. Yeah. I've been very fortunate for the last 7 years. I've been an advisor to the Belfast government. And some of you may have heard Northern Ireland has just announced a £45 million scheme to baseline every single field in Northern Ireland over the next 4 years. So if we want to go and look at carbon stocks and increasing carbon stocks, you need to know where you start from, and you need to have a net mechanism to come back and measure your progress against that. So our first plea, and what we've done is we've built our relationship with government, and government has come with us. So I would encourage, can we do that in England as well? The second thing, where I come from as a livestock farmer, is the carbon we put in soils will never be permanent. It's a biological system. So what we're advocating actually is an annual scheme, a retrospective, and you're measured on what is actually your activity over that period of time, with a 5-year check and balance. So we come back and measure your baseline every 5 years on your soil carbon. We're also doing aerial LiDAR surveys on every single tree and hedge, so that we actually measure additionality. Because at the end of the day, if you're going to trade something, it can only be additionality, and you have to prove that, and it needs to be robust. So key in this, I don't believe carbon is permanent in our landscape, but we can put checks and balances with 5-year waypoints and actually prove to concerned citizens that our train has left the station.
Thank you, John. And from DEFRA's point of view, how do you respond to that question about the permanence and the proof of it?
So I think there's a few aspects to this. There's for the private markets, there's how do you measure in a way that is seen to be reliable and trustworthy? How do you know it's additional, exactly as you say? And then how do you know it's enduring, at least, if not permanent? And we think the role of government there is to try and help set the rules of the game, exactly as Alex says, and to contribute to the development of standards, rules of the game, so that everybody can participate in the market in a fair way. The tricky thing about that is that the science around this is developing all the time, and is contested. And so we can't just go, well, we'll write some standards today then, and that's that done, and we'll move on to the next task, because if we do that, they'll be wrong by next week, probably. And what we also don't want to do is too hastily start trying to set rules of the game which accidentally crowd out a lot of the private investment that would otherwise come. And so what we're trying to do is get enough there for people to go on safely, but not go, as civil servants can often do, go so heavy that we just accidentally kill the whole thing. And so we've got to be a bit careful about it. I think it's not straightforward. In terms of the baseline, there is a funded natural capital ecosystem assessment that DEFRA is going to be undertaking over the next few years, which we want to use for the baseline, certainly for the government schemes, but also could be used more broadly, so that we can do exactly as you say and start working out, are we actually going in the right direction in general or not? And as part of that, we're also looking at the whole world of data, remote sensing, citizen data, and all those sorts of aspects that we could be leveraging. You're collecting data all the time on your farms through the kit that you use, etc. But all you use it for is that purpose quite a lot of the time. Could we use it for a wider purpose? I was just chatting to somebody about that outside. So there's a lot there about, we do need to establish the baseline, but we also need to be a bit smarter about it. The way we think about it now is, well, we'll commission someone and they'll do it. Well, there's a lot of the data there already. Can't we just aggregate it in some way, in a much more ongoing kind of way? And that's a kind of creative technology sort of thing that we want to be able to do. And then the final thing I would say is that from the perspective of government schemes, we've tested, should we do payment by results for things like carbon, habitat, biodiversity, and we've tried that out with some farmers, and what we found is that actually for government schemes, that probably isn't going to work, because what people are looking for in government schemes often is something where they can be confident that if they do the actions, they're going to get the money. So they don't want that to be a very risky investment. Somebody earlier on was saying it's more like a bond, whereas you might be dabbling a bit more in the stock market when you sell to the private sector. So for government schemes, the other thing is we're not only looking for carbon sequestration, we're looking for a wider range of outcomes. So obviously farmers are here to produce food primarily, so we want you to do that. We want you to have profitable businesses, and we also want you to contribute to improvements in biodiversity, water quality, air quality, carbon sequestration and reduction, and also climate change adaptation, because it's your land which is going to need to store the water and continue to grow food in a situation of more extreme weather events. And so we're paying for actions, and we choose actions which are likely to contribute to several of those outcomes at the same time, or more, perhaps more one than the other, but multiple outcomes. And as long as you take those actions in good faith, then we'll pay you. So we don't have to get into this whole question of, have you sequestered enough carbon in your soil? What about that bit of your field rather than that bit, etc.? Because that is a world of complexity and risk for people coming into schemes that we just don't think is at all helpful.
Thank you, Janet. And Jude, from the livestock sector point of view, are you being asked about this by the livestock farmers that you talk about in terms of carbon sequestration, permanence of these kind of carbon offsets?
Yeah, absolutely. Not always about permanence, but one of the biggest questions I get is, I'm told I need to cut my carbon footprint. I'm told I can do it by simply doing everything better, better reproduction, better management, better health, better welfare, but how do I do that on my farm? How do I do that compared to my neighbor, compared to the 200 cows or the 2,000 cows or the 20 cows? And that's where we don't always have all of the answers. And what we really need is some good joined up data on, for example, on a dairy farm, from an economic, from a social, and from a whole-scale environmental point of view. Is it more important to improve, age at first calving, or lameness, or mastitis, for example? And we don't always have all of those joined up answers. So I think one of the answers to that is more data and better data and joined up data and integration between all of our different apps and systems that we use every single day. Because if we had everything talking to each other, we could look at the patterns, we could look at the trends, we could look at the baseline, and we could have that integrated system where we say, okay, if we want to improve, biodiversity and carbon and water use and better rural outcomes and have an economic plus as well, actually we really need to be focusing on milk protein or the breed of our beef cow, versus going into things just in terms of yield or just in terms of age at slaughter. So it is so complicated, and we don't always have that data.
No, thanks. I mean, I think that's the point. Interoperability of data going forward is going to be so helpful that things talk to each other. Because I should have said, I'm a sheep farmer in Devon, and nothing irritates me more than having to input the same data 5 different ways for 5 different things, when actually it's the same data. And if I did it just the once and it could be shared, that would make my life easier. Johann, just to finish off this first round, your take on this question.
It's funny, isn't it? Because we're all here for a question time session at which we want some answers. And I think a lot of the questions that the audience is going to ask, we are not going to be able to give the answers to. On Janet's point, payment by results, I think we would agree with that at Farmers Weekly, that we know as farmers can do the right thing, but still not get the right result or the desired result through no fault of their own, be it weather related or pest and disease related or what have you. In the Farmers Weekly Transition Project, which is, we're trying to move our readers and take them on a journey from ostensibly the phase out of direct payments to the new way of working. We conducted a survey last year, and we're just repeating that survey this year. And the same thing is coming through, the lack of information that is available for people to make decisions. I would say that I think I agree that the important thing is to measure what you have, and it might not be the right time for you to embark on a scheme, especially a scheme that has got some kind of permanence attached to it. But as long as you measure what you have, at least then you're putting a benchmark there or a baseline there that when the time comes that you will be ready to move when you feel that the time is right for you.
Lovely, thanks, Johann. And just to finish this topic off, I'm afraid I've been working in the industry a long time, and I know we've got somebody sitting in the audience who probably knows more about the Farmland Carbon Code than many, and that's you, Matthew. And I'm just wondering whether you've got any comment on actually where you've got to with developing this code, because I think that would be really helpful at this point to add that to the conversation.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Matthew Woolman, Director of Sustainable Soils Alliance, and as Liz says, Programme Manager for the Farm Soil Carbon Code, which is an environment agency-funded project which we hope will bring some credibility, consistency, robustness to the farm soil carbon marketplace and address a lot of the topics that we're hearing today and at other events. We started off very much with the vision of creating a farm soil carbon code that would sit alongside those for woodland and peatland. However, in the last couple of months, we're considering, I guess, a pivot towards, in fact, creating rather more what Alex was talking about, which is the development of minimum standards that can be then used by farmers, by investors, by other stakeholders to examine all the schemes and projects out there and really decide whether or not they are they're fit for purpose. And these minimum standards would address permanence, they'd address additionality, they'd address, obviously, measuring, reporting, and verification. And these are something that we hope to be putting out to some kind of public consultation in the months to come. So please do go to our website, Sustainable Soils Alliance, to get involved with that. It's very important that we get the balance right between bringing consistency to the marketplace, but also to Janet's point, making sure that it reflects changes in innovation regarding the technology, measurement techniques, modeling, which is going to be critical, for underpinning the value of any farm soil carbon sequestered. So we really need, farmer investor input, stakeholder input into all aspects of that. So please do get involved and get in touch.
Lovely, thank you, Matthew. And I think it's really helpful to know that this work is in progress and it really is starting to move to get to results. Now, I've got 3 questions that I've clocked. I don't know where you've got questions. I've got one here on the front row, a gentleman over there, and then a gentleman in the second row, and then a gentleman there. And, oh gosh, they're coming up all over the place. So I don't know if we start with the lady in the front row, and then I think probably go to the first one that you've clocked after that. Thank you.
Hello, I'd like to thank my awesome Oxford Farming Conference directors for setting this up. I used the word awesome, Will, I hope you caught that. So Emily Norton, chair of the Oxford Farming Conference, also director of rural research at Savills. What I find really, really interesting in this space at the moment is the interaction between offsetting and the carbon opportunity, which an awful lot of people are seeing big bucks associated with, and creating basically biodiverse, carbon-rich, valuable farmed spaces that are still economically viable. And the big question that I think is not being answered in that space, and which I hope the Oxford Farming Conference report this year is going to look at, is the role of supply chains within that, and what responsibility our supply chains should have in creating biodiverse carbon stores of nature that meet and kind of account for all of those balances. So I'd be particularly interested for your thoughts on how we can reconcile perhaps the expectations of carbon markets with the expectations of supply chains who are looking at farming as a Scope 3 problem. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Emily. And I think it's a very real issue, because I know myself as a farmer, I'm pretty certain that my customer is going to come to me soon and ask me about my carbon footprint almost as an eligibility criteria to supply. So, I mean, I think thank you, I think it's a really pertinent question. So I'm going to sort of swap around the order, and Johann, I'm going to come to you first. Apologies if you're still writing notes, but yeah.
It's another difficult one, isn't it? I think with the, we would agree, and we're seeing it more and more in terms of farm buyers requiring farmers to undertake certain practices which reduce their carbon footprint, and we're only going to see that grow. I'm thinking of things like McCain's requiring their potato suppliers to use regenerative practices by 2030, which is something that we're actually looking at Farmers Weekly at the moment. And it's an interesting idea, because there are these requirements that almost, in some respects, go above and beyond regen agriculture and carbon sequestration, and in other respects are diametrically opposed to it. And I'm thinking, how can you have a regen ag root crop when one of the principles of regenerative agriculture is not to disturb the soil? So,
yeah. Thank you, Johann. And I'm going to direct this one, I think, to you, Janet. How do you sort of see the equity in these relationships? Because potentially the value of farmers' carbon sequestration could potentially be being hijacked by their customers in order to meet their commitments to net zero. Is that the way that it really should be going, or is there another way?
It's really tricky, this, because I suppose the question is, who's doing the work? The farmer is. Who's making the profit? Not the farmer.
Yes.
Whether it's the supply chain or the carbon markets or anybody else. And that's a problem, because there's a gap between what consumers want and what they're willing to pay for the things that they want. And sometimes that's where government comes in, but we think that's also where carbon trading markets can come in. And it's also where more measures to do with supply chain fairness ought to come in more broadly. in terms of making sure that the farmer gets a fair slice of the cost of the profit and of the cost of production. So I think there's a huge whole range. It's a really very important question. There's a huge range of issues around either supply chain fairness, what are the kind of ethics of who's producing the carbon in the first place, who's storing it, what's that offsetting? Is that letting somebody else off the hook who should actually be reducing their own carbon? What's the balance between the farm itself becoming net zero and offsetting other people's? I think it's such a sort of fiendishly complicated set of issues. And part of the risk, so one of the things that could happen is 1,000 flowers could bloom, and then we could have a period of chaos, and then things will settle. That's how things generally go if you just kind of leave them to it. And I think there's an amount of that probably has to happen, actually, to see like where's the equilibrium going to end up. My worry is that because of the nature of supply chains and the way that the market works, the equilibrium will not be in favour of the farmer, and that's going to threaten farm business viability. And that's why this is one of the reasons why we can't just make firm government policy right now, because there's so much unknown about how that's all going to play out, what choices a farmer's going to make, how is the supply chain going to deal with this new expectation that's been placed upon it. So I think where we see government fitting in, as I said, is about the kind of rules of the game for the exchange market, also in terms of regulating to make sure that the supply chain is fair, and there's been various consultations on that and further ones to come about different sectors. And then the government schemes and regulations that I'm responsible for, where we'll pay farmers to take actions. But we need to make sure that in doing that, we're not continuing to prop up actually unfair practices elsewhere in the system. So this is why we're taking, although it looks messy, and I know it does, and it's frustrating and uncertain, this is why we're taking a test and learn approach to the way we're managing the agricultural transition. Because if we were to sit here now and say, here's some certainty for the next decade, I absolutely guarantee you we would be wrong in that uncertainty. And so we've got to be able to flex and adapt, but we've also got to respect the fact farmers need to plan ahead. It's a really tricky set of balances. So I don't know the answer. I think it's a really important question, and I think it's going to take all of us working through it together to find the answer.
Yeah. Thanks, Janet. I think certainly, my feeling about it is that we need to find some way to get supply chains to take some responsibility as well, rather than pushing it on farmers, because they might be the cheapest way for the supply chain, but that may let the supply chain off the hook of reducing their emissions, which is also critical. John, your experience from Northern Ireland, where are people at there in this debate?
So we're in a different position because we export 80% of our food.
Right.
And with the affordability crisis, we're hearing our food purchasers, a lot of interesting stories, but they're not putting money where their mouth is.
Nope.
And the affordability crisis, that's only getting worse. So our driver in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland is the same. It's actually government. Our driver is 33% of our greenhouse gas emissions in Northern Ireland come from agriculture.
Yeah.
So we have to get, in the national inventory, we have to get our carbon emissions down. So Belfast takes a different view from London, is Belfast wants carbon reduction down to claim for government to reduce the national inventory. So the big driver coming is to get our national inventory down. And so we need to be very careful when we go on this journey. There are two purchasers of carbon. There is the private sector, whether it is the retail chain or whether it's Michael O'Leary and Ryanair, or whether it's government, because government still needs to get the national inventory down.
Yeah.
Every year, they have to report on the national inventory. And the schemes of government funds, they will claim the carbon reduction and they will use that to reduce the national greenhouse gas inventory. So our approach is, that's why we're going down the baselining route. If you want any future payment beyond 2024, you have to baseline. End of story. There's no quibble. You have to baseline. You have to go into the soil nutrient health and LIDAR scheme.
Sure.
And then we're going to repeat it every 5 years. And we're going to see, can we get the additionality, both in getting greenhouse gas emissions down and carbon stocks up. Mainly because governments see they need that evidence to produce to IPCC to get the national inventory down. So our driver in Northern Ireland is completely different to the driver here in England. And it is government who's cracking the whip here, is that they need to get the national inventory down.
And to be absolutely clear, John, when you say get the national inventory down, you mean reduce emissions or reduce the net emissions?
So that's a great debate. Okay,
Right.
At the moment, the national inventory does not recognize carbon sequestration.
Okay, so it's getting emissions.
So that's not, well, hold on, Belfast is, we will be measuring change in carbon stocks as well. So Belfast government has recognised that actually net zero is not about zero emissions. It is about when your carbon emissions equal your carbon sequestration.
Right.
That's what it is. So to do that, you need to do your baseline on emissions and your baseline on changes in carbon stocks. And bring one down, bring one up, and somewhere it'll meet in the middle. And that is what we're talking about.
Okay, thank you for that clarification, because that's important. And Alex, from your point of view, from your business, are you getting approaches from supply chains that want to work with you, or is it primarily farm businesses?
So it's a mixture. So, insetting is definitely looking like it's got a huge amount of potential. Yeah. For me, probably my farming hat on, I then look at this and go, is the value going to be passed on to the farmer for basically what John just said, a huge amount of additional, certainly reporting, measuring and reporting that you're going to need to do. So is that value going to be passed on? Is that reflected through a premium in the product that you're producing? If it is, and you can move towards that net zero goal quicker, then can you achieve a premium? Therefore, it starts to have a tangible value to you. You can realize it on your balance sheet. Good news. If not, then it's much harder to move forward. The problem comes that there's so much uncertainty. And so this is, for me, it needs a bit more balance, maybe a little bit less uncertainty than we've currently got. Because, I mean, take one example. You do an insetting deal with whoever you're selling some of your farm produce to start to offset the emissions through the supply chain there. And then you also go into the SFI under ELMS. And at the moment, we have no idea, or unless I learned today, which I'd love to, then whether at the SFI and the soil payments are going to include soil carbon, or whether it's just soil health. And actually, this is not far away. From a measurement perspective, I personally want to be knowing this now. Yeah. And so that is a degree of certainty. I don't need a soil carbon code to know whether ELMS is going to appropriate soil carbon. All I need is something on paper suggesting that actually that ELMS soil payments are focused on health and that they do not include carbon. That gives the private market, gives all of you a huge amount of certainty. Yeah. And that shouldn't be that difficult to get to.
No, I don't think that is that difficult to get to. And I think it's a really helpful way of putting it. I think actually for the soil standards in the Sustainable Farming Incentive, which you'll be able to take part in from the end of June, we previously announced, and are still on track to do, primarily what we're interested in there is much more about climate change adaptation. It is about soil health, and it is about being able to store more water, improving biodiversity, improving soil health. There are some carbon benefits, but overwhelmingly the benefits that we can see at the moment are in the other direction. So I don't see any reason why we couldn't articulate that. And then because what we want you to be able to do, the policy intent is that you, the farmer, should be able to earn an income from government schemes for some things that you're doing and some of the value that you're creating, and also earn an income from private schemes. And there are some farmers doing this already with water companies and others, but you have to be pretty entrepreneurial to do it, and you have to have a fairly hefty risk appetite for not worrying too much about what happens.
Farmers want to be able to stack their revenue
streams.
And I would argue with water companies now, they're not stacking those revenue streams. The water companies are paying for exactly the same thing that countryside stewardship is paying for. That's not stacking your revenue streams. There's zero.
That's getting paid twice.
Benefit. That's getting paid twice.
Yeah.
What are the water companies paying for? Improvements to water quality. What's countryside stewardship paying for as a wild bird seed mix? It's paying for a wildlife benefit. Of course, it's all interlinked, and that's why looking at this through a sort of natural capital lens, that everything is interlinked, but it has to be directed, and that degree of certainty, whether it's saying it's not paying for something, is just as important.
Yeah.
Yeah. And certainly that's an area I want to come on to, that sort of the speed of certainty for farmers. But on this topic, I want to turn to you, Jude, because you are the ABP Professor of Sustainable Livestock. And I wondered whether you could comment on where ABP and Sainsbury's are in this debate, because obviously ABP is one of the largest abattoirs slaughtering cattle and lamb in the UK, supplying Sainsbury's as a main customer. So, what's their stance on this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's clear that the supply chain has huge opportunities, both in terms of improving what happens on farm, whether that's through premiums, whether that's through a sort of pay-to-play approach. And I think Liz is absolutely right in the opening comments that it isn't going to be long that you will have to do your carbon footprint and other metrics as well to be able to play. And I can only talk from an ABP point of view, but for most of the meat processors, it is clear that cattle, sheep and pigs contribute the greatest proportion of the carbon footprint. So for ABP, for example, it's obviously in their best interest to improve what happens on farm in terms of cutting the carbon footprint, improving biodiversity, water quality, soil health, etc., both from a better farm and a better supply chain, healthier meat, more meat, etc., but also for their emissions. And I think it should be thought of, and I'm not just saying this with my ABP hat on, as a win-win. You know, we can all improve, we can all be better through those improvements. I think the biggest challenge that our sector has across the UK is to reach the farmers who aren't here, who aren't in an integrated supply chain. Because it's very easy if you're in an integrated chain where they guarantee that they'll buy your calves at 6 weeks old, you know, yada, 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 they can impose management practices or specific things that should happen on that farm. But there's still an awful lot of cattle, for example, that go through markets that aren't weighed. We know that 50% of farmers in the UK don't weigh their cattle, for example. And there's huge losses and huge inefficiencies. And the greatest gains that we can make across the sector are from the people who aren't here, who don't read the Farmers Weekly, who don't go to conferences, who don't look at things from the NFU or AHDB or the universities on simply how to do everything better. And how we reach those guys, I think, will be really interesting going forwards. And I'd almost be tempted to say, with the changes to funding, perhaps they won't be in place in 10, 20, 30 years' time. But again, that remains to be seen.
Yeah, some controversial thoughts there. In true question time tradition, before we move on to the next question, and we have got loads, I just wanted to give an opportunity if anybody in the audience has got a comment they'd like to make to what they've just heard in that last question. You've got your hand up, sir, at the back. Is yours a comment on what that gentleman there? And then we'll move on to the next questioner, sorry. It's really just to sort of see how you're reacting to what you're hearing.
It's just a comment really to Janet, and just to say thanks for coming. It's brilliant that you're here, and I know it must be very difficult working in government with the Treasury and everything else that's going on in terms of maybe not being as dynamic as you might want to be. But just hearing from the conversation and discussion, it does feel like there is, we have the position now where there is kind of minimum guidelines and regulation possibilities where you could really step forward and make a brave move to actually a little bit of leadership. Because I think everyone is crying out for that leadership because it is so confusing. And I think everybody would echo this. And I think the evidence is there. Yeah. I think you can have some insurance policies with some of the ways that maybe some of the payments are suggested or proposed. And that, there'll be a number of ways where you can potentially sort of, get out of being responsible. But I think some form of leadership is needed. And I think all that I would do is urge you to go back and give it a bit of energy and propulsion and make it happen. So.
And I wouldn't like you to, sorry, I was going to say, I wouldn't like you to think there's nothing happening and we're just sitting chilling, waiting to see how things pan out. There is a team in DEFRA that is working on this, and Richard Benyon is overseeing that work and is all over it. There's no doubt at all about the importance of this and the urgency of getting some stuff done. I was just meaning to point to the fact that it's quite complicated and we're not going to have 100% of the answer soon. But if I've left you in any doubt as to whether we're pursuing these issues with any energy, we definitely are. We're just not quite there yet.
Yeah, and perhaps in this instance, the case of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Absolutely.
Because I don't think we're going to get there the first time round.
No.
And I certainly know with all the carbon codes, they publish a Mark 1 and then they review it. And I think we might be in that space now because I know that so many farmers are sitting on their hands at the moment when possibly they would be taking action if they had a better indication of the direction of travel. But sorry, I'm hogging it.
But Liz, can I come back on that? Because certainly we in pasture agriculture are going through revolution at the moment. Fertilizer is £1,000 a tonne.
Yep.
Clover seed has gone out the door. And we're seeing huge move from synthetic nitrogen to legumes, okay? By conventional agriculture, not by regenerative agriculture, okay? If we don't do our baselines today, we will miss a huge impact on soils.
Yes.
And, you know, my nervousness as an outsider watching what's going on in England is you're not going to capture this change.
No.
Yeah.
We're doing our baselines now because if anyone's going to do this behavioral change, which the industry is doing, baseline your soil today, go back and do it in 3 or 4 years' time and see how legumes have transformed your soil. Then you've got a narrative to communicate. Just my concern as an outsider looking in is you're missing a golden opportunity. Something's happening today. Nitrogen is 1,000 pounds a ton. People are planting legumes like we've never seen it before. Let's capture the benefit to soils today.
No, thanks, John. And Janet?
I just want to say that we definitely are on the case with that, and I feel like I'm doing a sales pitch, but the Sustainable Farming Incentive, open to application shortly, will include, their standards are about soil health, and one of the things that we'll pay farmers to do is measure soil organic matter and carry out soil assessments of the health of the soil. So, and not to give it to us actually, but so that you can see what is it now and how does it change over time when you do these practices. So I think we do really recognise that. There is though an outstanding question, which is, do we just leave it that farmers keep that data? At the moment, we think that's what we have to do because we don't want to give the impression that we're going to use it to beat farmers over the head with. And in a situation of mistrust, which is what we have, and we have to build out from, then that's what people will assume we're going to do if we get them to give us the data. So we don't want people to do that. We want people to use the data themselves. But over time, you would like to have, wouldn't you, a national picture, exactly as you say, of what's happening. But the most important thing is for the farmer to know what's happening.
Correct.
So they can see what's working and what's not, and then adjust their practices accordingly. And that's why we're paying for it.
And to get the credit for it.
To get the credit,
Yeah.
but it also brings its own benefit, because if you go and transition to more clover, you will better fix nitrogen without artificial fertilizers. So there is an inherent benefit. I'm really conscious that I can see all the hands that are shooting up. So I think the man with the mic knows who's next. So we'll go with your first one. Then we'll just go on the hands, because there's so many. And I haven't forgotten you, sir, over there.
I just have a question. I'm an outsider to this industry as well, so I'm looking in. And in the space where I come from, we always look at where is demand. And I hear a lot of discussion about supply and the standards of supply, farmers this and standards this. But if you look at demand, which are presumably the corporates that have to meet 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050, net zero, which is at pre-industrial level, when you start asking them, they have billions of pounds. They're not particularly interested in many of the things that are being discussed here. They're just wanting to do that trade.
Yes.
And I was just wondering, what is, in your view to the panel, what is happening to actually accommodate demand as opposed to take care of supply, if you see that distinction? Because if billions flow in, things right-size themselves quite quickly. It's when a few 100,000 flow in that you're kind of wondering, shall I not, maybe, maybe not. But when the price is overwhelmingly positive, then why wouldn't it right-size itself quickly? And I don't hear the view of the big corporates or the big banks that might want to invest in this and that could, no disparagement on the government, but they can dwarf the government in terms of money that they can push into the marketplace by multiples.
Okay. So the question, for those of you who perhaps didn't catch it, was more about, so what's the demand side doing? What's happening out there? And certainly I know that in places like Wales, there's concern amongst farmers about the amount of land that's being bought up by investors to plant trees. But I think I'll start with you, Johann, on this question. And it's this whole thing about actually who wants this carbon? And, you know, how are they managing themselves? And do you see a pattern emerging?
I think we see people outside of agriculture certainly coming into the land market and buying land in places like Wales, in places like Scotland, and pricing farmers out of the market.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, certainly that's causing some concern in these places, isn't it? And clearly those people are looking for the cheapest way to offset their carbon footprint. And, you know, I'll come to you next, Alex, because you must be working in this space.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of demand out there. Just look at the commitments that so many you know, corporates and institutional clients, institutional landowners have made. You know, you mentioned McCain's down the line, you know, for 2029. Almost every large corporate out there has made some form of commitment to net zero, and that's aside for what the government has put forward. my question to you would be, where do you offset that at the moment? You know, you've got woodland carbon code, that's one way to do it. Okay, you've got the peatland carbon code, that's one way to do it. Neither of them perfect, but both of them good to have. At the moment, I would also be wary of confusing things like commercial forestry, which has gone through an absolute boom with a natural capital buyer of that land, because there's very much a difference, certainly under the woodland carbon code, as to whether you would have the additionality amongst other things in that. So I think that's one thing to be wary of. But specifically around demand, this is where I would argue something like soil carbon can start to meet it. Otherwise, where do you go? Do you go offshore with that? And that's where we've seen, you know, RED Plus, various systems, because it's much cheaper to go offshore at the moment. You can offset it through potentially through solar schemes. Cook stoves in India, you pick it. What's the quality? What's the accountability? You know, the demand is there if we can start to feed it in the right way.
Okay, I'm going to have a comment from John. Then what I'm going to do is go to 2 or 3 questioners, because I've just been told that we've only got 10 minutes left, which is just stunning how many questions there are. So John, your comment.
Yeah, I'm going to challenge the issue on the demand side, and I'm being purposely flippant from a farmer's point of view.
Yeah.
Because there are 2 carbon prices out there today. In the voluntary market, if you get 10 to 15 pounds a tonne, you're doing well. In the statutory market, you're getting 80 pounds a tonne. Okay? So why are investors looking at this? They know at some stage the carbon price in the voluntary market is going to go closer to the statutory market. So if I wear my farmer hat on, if I'm going to sell my carbon, I'm going to hold on. I want the statutory price. I am happy to do the measuring, reporting, and verification, so I don't have inferior carbon, that my carbon is bang on the money, and I want the statutory price. And I think farmers need to be very careful. I mean, at the Oxford Farming Conference in January, there was a warning, be very wary of selling your carbon too early.
Absolutely.
And so I would ask farmers going on this journey, do it with your eyes wide open. And at some stage, there will have to be a statutory scheme for our sector, because government still needs to get the national infantry down. Yes. Okay? And that is certainly in the European Commission. They currently, DG Klima, have been told by the end of this year, bring forward a consultation on a scheme for this sector. Yeah. And so if you have sold all your carbon forward and then a statutory scheme is imposed on you, what are you going to do? So we need to be very careful. We do need a degree of clarity. We need a rigorous strategic conversation about the direction of travel here.
No, I can see exactly what you're saying. And that whole thing about thinking about when you sell it, how much for, and to whom. Do you sell it out of country or do you sell it in the UK? Because obviously that will affect our national inventory. If farmers sell their carbon overseas, it's not available here. So I'm going to take the question from this very patient gentleman over here, and then I'm going to go with the next. So let's take 2 questions, you, sir, and then the next questioner, which I think is behind here.
Thanks very much. Bill Herditch from Australia. I just want to ask a question as to whether it's a chicken and egg question actually, are we so confusing the regenerative chicken with the carbon neutral egg? and the lady at the end, the professor said, we've got to get more people over to this type of farming. There's a whole mass of people. So by chasing carbon per se, we're missing the point. We've got to get our production systems changed over. There's so much. In Australia, we've got, we've lost 70% of our soil carbon since European settlement. We've got a huge amount to make up. So there's practice change has got to be driving this, not carbon sales. Yeah. We've got our carbon method in Australia. We've been doing it for 10 years. It's taken more than 10 years to sort it out. So there's 10 years ahead of us in Britain.
Thank you very much for that comment, sir. Very good point, very well made. The next question, I think, is this gentleman here in the second row. And then we will take the question of the gentleman there with his hand up, and then we'll answer those 2 questions. I'm sorry if you'll have to, go for it.
No, it's a really simple question, in actual fact. Are we actually confident in the methodology of which we're measuring carbon?
Thank you. And then we'll take the question from this gentleman here. You had your hand up, sir, with the beard. Thank you.
It's really interesting hearing the comments about the, apologies.
Yeah.
It's really interesting hearing comments about the unknowns with soil organic carbon and also the amount of offsetting that needs to happen. But there are methodologies of soil inorganic carbon that already exist, whether that's through pyrolysis and biochar or potentially enhanced rock weathering coming in the future, that could add to all of this. And what's interesting is that farmers here have the assets by which to do this that gets them over the line. So whether it's their land or their byproduct, their organic byproduct for pyrolysis, these things already exist, and their permanence and their recalcitrance are already proven scientifically. And it'd be interesting to just hear what your thoughts are on that.
Thank you very much. So we'll conflate those two questions. So the first question was about how reliable is the methodology for measuring carbon, and the second question is very much about actually are we confident in these processes that we're applying. So I'm going to start with you, Janet. I mean, it may be a little unfair because I'm not sure how close you are to those methodologies, but it's something that has been kind of taxing many of us in this sector for a while.
Yeah, and I should be really clear that it is a different team in DEFRA that look after this, not me. So I can tell you what I know, but I'm not responsible for it. But I can tell you what I know, which is that, well, there are ways of measuring soil organic matter, certainly, and also soil carbon. But where you measure them, how deep you go, how frequent, what weather was it when you did it, all those things will affect, and where in the field did you do it? Is it in your sandy bit or your clay bit or what? Where, like, all of these things affect the outcome, and you'll get very, very variable results. And so that's why the soil carbon code is really important, and the setting of standards is really important, so that everybody can be confident that, like, before you get to anything about additionality or permanence or anything else, you need to know how much is there in some kind of objective way, and is that a reliable measure? And so we do think government has a role to play in helping to set those standards. And in the area of stuff that I am responsible for, we're looking at as that develops, how do we build that into schemes, and can we help farmers to gather that data? Can we help them meet the costs of doing that? But you've always got to be really careful when you're doing things. When you do something as government, you crowd out someone else doing it, and so we have to have a clear view of what part do we think each part of the system should be playing here.
Yes.
Just because something needs doing doesn't mean government should necessarily do it, and that's not necessarily a sustainable thing forever. So there's a sort of convening role that we need to play, and in some cases, as this gentleman here said, definitely a doing role. Can I just briefly come back to what the gentleman over there said, because I really want to heartily agree with that. What you said reminded me of, I'm a student of failure in government, and that's why I run big, complicated things that nobody else wants to run, because I really like difficult stuff and I read about it a lot. And what system thinking would tell you that if what you're doing is trying to save money, you will always fail, because you'll create problems elsewhere in your system. And this debate reminds me of that. If all you're trying to do is save carbon, you may well create problems elsewhere in your system. And that's why in our schemes, what we're trying to do instead is say, do these actions to look after your soil. They will benefit carbon, they'll benefit soil health, they'll prevent runoff, it'll be good for biodiversity, but actually it's not one of those outcomes we're chasing. We just know this is a good practice to do. Please do that practice. And I think you're absolutely on the money there, saying really what we need to be, what I think we would like farmers to be thinking about is their business model in a broader sense than they might do now. Yeah. So the business model is I produce food, let's say, but the wider business model is I produce food and other goods. How do I get an income from those and meet the costs of producing them? And how do I do that in a way that makes sense for the business as a whole, not pursuing one particular outcome over all of those? So I think you're dead right there.
No, thank you for that, Janet. And certainly all my experience suggests that if we're going to solve this, we have to look at the whole system, not cherry pick individual elements, because we'll have the unintended consequences if we just focus on one thing only. I want to come to you, Alex, because I think Ben's question, very telling, you know, the methodology that you use for measuring carbon, I mean, obviously you're trading on the back of it. Yep. So are you confident in it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll put my head on the block here. So on the farm at home, I was looking at this going, we're about to go through quite a significant change. I really, really want to establish my baseline, as John said, absolutely critical. There is no funding for me to do that. Well, there is a little bit of funding through countryside stewardship for me to do that on permanent pasture, but particularly on the arable areas that are going into two-year legume fallows and things like that, the AB15 options, going, right, I really want to start to understand what this is going to do and whether I can potentially monetize it down the line. Now, I would strongly argue that as Liz said, that the perfect shouldn't be the enemy of the good. We know how to measure soil organic carbon and bulk density. Now, there are lots of other factors that start to contribute towards being able to sequester and store carbon within the soil, but it is not beyond the realms of the system at the moment to be able to give us some guidance to do this in a methodical, robust way. The problem at the moment is we just haven't got to that yet. I think the other side to this is that's on-the-ground measurements, which certainly if you want to monetize anything, you're going to have to do. So I don't think there's any escape from that. What I would suggest is that there's a precursor to that, which is where technology, and particularly what we're trying to do with Nature Capital, is the technology to start to give you that first look. How are you performing at the moment? What have you got? Where's that starting point? It's not necessarily to directly monetize it, it's to get you going so that you can start to go, right, well, I need to focus my ground truthing efforts on this plot here, or I want to start to deliver a land use change on there. What might that cost to deliver it? How much carbon might it sequester? What might that be worth? There's so much information to try and pull in to inform your strategy and your land management plan on the farm. But it is doable.
No, thank you. And John, from your perspective in Ireland, obviously, you're very clear about Northern Ireland's strategy to reduce the national inventory. So what methodologies are you relying on there to measure soil carbon?
So we haven't gone hung up on the methodology.
Right.
We're taking IPCC and FAO methodology,
okay,
internationally recognized. We believe the biggest knowledge gap is not the methodology, is actually what is the behavioral change we need to do to improve carbon sequestration. Yeah. So that's why we believe in doing a baseline and repeating it every 5 years, we will answer the knowledge gap.
Yes. Yep.
Is what soils can sequester what carbon with what activity. And that is the elephant in the room. We don't have that data at the moment. So doing massive baselining and repeating it every 5 years, we will answer that knowledge question.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and certainly I was just going to draw people's attention to a session that took place this morning in the Yo Valley tent, where the Farm Carbon Toolkit's Becky Wilson was actually talking about the evidence from the work they've been doing with 25 pilot dairy farms, where they've actually been collecting the soil carbon data and relating it to farm practice. And they're already seeing that bringing diverse lays onto dairy farms is increasing soil carbon in that middle layer. So they're actually also following FAO protocols.
And even just grazing animals.
Yes.
The difference between grazing animals and cutting grass and feeding that cut grass to animals. Massive difference to soil carbon.
But I agree that it's that evidence base, because up until a few years ago, we quite frankly weren't that interested. But clearly now it's become of vital importance. I suspect I'm getting the signals from the back of the room that we're out of time, but I just wanted to really just recap on what we've been talking about, because actually I think we've covered a lot of the really important issues. So we started off by talking about permanence, and what does that mean? How do we measure it? And how can a farmer respond in this environment of not wanting to be caught out by having impossible things to deliver on for relatively low sums of money. And then we moved on to talking about supply chain, and effectively, whose responsibility is it anyway? Who carries the can? And actually, how do we make sure that everybody plays their part in this, rather than the cost of it all being devolved onto the least powerful player in the supply chain? And I think, as farmers, we probably know who that is. Then we moved on to sort of talking more about the actual mechanisms for offset, who wants it. We talked about the demand side of it. Clearly really important how, as a country, we deliver that, because potentially, as a country, we could make ourselves very high carbon producers if a lot of that offset is sold out of the country, and also potentially make ourselves high carbon producers. But I think then that the real message that's coming through all of this is we can't simply focus just on one thing. And certainly something I've learned through my career in agriculture is that we need to really focus on looking at the whole system, because if we focus on one thing only, we'll be damn good at that, but we won't notice the unintended consequences that are not so good that are happening over there. And I think with this particular question, we have to look at it in the round. So with that, I'd really like to thank my actually brilliant panelists. So thank you to Jude, to John, to Janet, to Alex, and to Johann. And if you'd all like to